Well, hello again, and another warm welcome back to your favourite classic dirt bike TV channel as we make our way around the Telford International Centre to check out some of those very nice vintage dirt bikes at the 2022 Classic Dirt Bike Show. Now, this event was held over the weekend of February the 12th and 13th, and this, of course, is part one of a selection of videos I'll be posting from that show. Okay, so first up we're going to take a look at a couple of nice bikes from the Dot Motorcycle Owners Club, and our first machine here is this very nice 1952 Dot Villiers 197cc trials machine. Now, of course, Dot Motorcycles is another of the old British manufacturers dating back as far as 1903, when it was first founded by the great Harvey. Now, the motor in this particular bike is a 197cc 3-speed 2-stroke engine with a wet clutch on this left-hand side of the motor, and of course the gear shifter would be on the right, as with many of the other British made bikes of its day. Now, it's quite a radical looking exhaust system on this little Villiers, and I'm not entirely sure what that canister there is on the header pipe, but it might be some kind of spark arrestor or something similar, but it's still a fantastic looking old bike, and that gearbox there just bolts onto the back of the engine's casings, just like the old Greaves bikes of their time. Now, again, I'm not entirely sure if this bike is 100% original or if it's been restored at one time, but it's still in remarkable condition for a 70-year-old machine. And if you wanted to buy one of these old Dots back in 1952, then I think this bike would have cost you about £131 at that time, but a very nice bike, and just one of the many machines the club had on display. Now, this bike here is another of the Dots sitting on their stand, although I'm not entirely sure as to the actual model, but a nice little scrambles bike with those leading link front suspension units, and of course again that Villiers 2-stroke motor in the frame. Although back in the 1950s and 60s these Dot off-roaders were very common as scrambles and trials bikes, and of course, Dot also manufactured a large array of road-going machines as well, and the Dot Motorcycle Owners Club here are quite a good contact if you need advice on parts or any other information on these iconic made British machines. And back in the day, of course, Dot Motorcycles adopted that now famous abbreviation of their Dot factory logo, which was titled Devoid of Trouble, which they then of course added to the logo on their fuel tanks, and that has been part of their maker's trademark for many years. Now, up until about the late 1960s, I think Dot were still producing motorcycles, although I think it was sometime later they then lost their Villiers engine suppliers, and in the 1970s, of course, Japan were then swamping the UK with cheaper and some would say even better bikes, and the likes of the smaller Dot companies just couldn't compete with the might of the Japanese. Although that's not to say that these old Dot bikes weren't a good motorcycle, and although their marketing logo was devoid of trouble, they still had their little idiosyncrasies and other little problems, just like any other mechanical motorcycles of their day. And who knows if they had never lost their Villiers engine suppliers and suffered the might of the Japanese invasion of bikes during the 1970s, then who knows, they may have gone on to bigger and much better things in the years to follow. Although it's certainly thanks to the very hard work and dedication of enthusiasts like the Dot Motorcycle Owners Club who keep the memory of these old classics alive, because without of course, their enthusiasm for the brand, we may never ever get the chance to look at these old British classic bikes. Okay, so as we move along, we're going to now take a brief look at the Golden Valley Classic stand, who once more had quite a few nice bikes on display, beginning with this lovely old Matchless, which again is one of those proper old school types of scrambles bikes. Now, at the time I grabbed these clips, there wasn't really any information about the bike at the time, and I can't supply you with any specs or details about either the frame or the motor, but I'm sure all you Matchless experts out there have already sussed out what you're looking at. But another lovely old motocrosser, again with that big long stroking Matchless 4-stroke engine. And when you look at the engineering that went into these old bikes back in the day, it certainly shows you that the talent that we had for building motorcycles here in the UK. And this old Matchless is certainly a fine example. Now, another old race bike the Golden Valley lads had on their stand was this quite unusual Triumph Twin Trials machine. Now, as far as I'm aware, it's a 1952 500 Triumph Twin, and I'm sure that one of the lads on the stand on the day told me that these motors were originally supplied to the military way back in the day. Now, I'm sure that all of you Triumph experts out there will already know all about this particular engine and its specifications, although for me personally, it's the first time I've really seen a Triumph Twin with these very short barrels and cylinder head. But again, that's the great thing about these classic bike shows like Telford. You just never know what you're going to come across next as you make your way around the hundreds of old classics on display. But then again, this particular engine could be a version of the old Triumph TRW 500, which was designed during the Second World War, and this of course fits in with it being made for the military use. Now, at first glance you'd think that this was a two-stroke top end, but as I recall, I think it was actually a side valve vertical twin that had a special type of exhaust pipe fitted to it to keep it super quiet, so as not to alert the enemy to its presence. So it's probably pretty fair to say that these engines would have been fitted into the likes of courier dispatch riders' machines and maybe the military police bikes of their day. But it's quite well documented that although these Triumph motors were designed for domestic use in the UK, most of them were actually exported to European countries, and it's said that many were actually bought by the Canadian military as well. But again, another rare old classic, and I expect you'll be very hard pressed to find another example of these Triumph engined bikes at the show, such as their rarity and wartime involvement, but certainly another British classic, that's for sure. And so next up we have another classic British mark, once again with the Cotton Owners Club stand, and they again had some very fine examples of the Cotton motorcycle brand, including this lovely Cotton Star Maker, which again is the Cotton frame with the Villiers Star Maker two-stroke motor in the chassis. Now, this example here will more than likely be around a mid-1960s bike with that steel-made chassis, the fiberglass fuel tank, and of course that high-level tailpipe at the rear. But again, these old Star Makers were highly competitive back in the day because they had a reasonably light steel chassis and that good Villiers two-stroke motor, and of course the combination of the frame and engine made these bikes very easy to throw around the racetrack. Now, as you know, these Villiers Star Maker motors were very similar to the old HIS Stormer motors, although there were subtle differences between the two. And most of the differences were relating to the mechanicals inside the engines. Although back in the 1960s, these fuel tanks would have been made from fiberglass at that time, which was the weight-saving material of choice for many off-road motorcycle manufacturers of their day. And I think that it was around 1964 that Villiers also made a twin carburetor version of the Star Maker engine, and I think it was called the Cotton Cobra. But again, and as in the case of the DOT machines that we saw earlier, Cotton also had a slogan on their Cotton emblem that read the motorcycle masterpiece, which just like the British DOT factory was a very bold statement for an early British motorcycle builder. Although without question these old Cotton Star Makers were still very good bikes and reasonably competitive during the 1960s when some of the UK's top riders rode them, and this example here is of course not 100% original, but it's still great to be able to take a look at these once great British icons of our sport from the golden years of British scrambling. And of course this couple of examples here are just a sample of the many bikes that the Cotton Owners Club had on their stand over the course of the 2 days. Okay, so next up we're going to take a look at a couple of Italian machines from the Moto Marini Riders Club, who had a stand just outside the main hall at the show. And this first bike here is a 1981 350 Kangaroo adventure type machine, which they say was Marini's first ever production bike to have monoshock suspension on the rear. Now it's said that these sold very well in Europe, but very few were actually sold here in the UK. Now, although this was just a 350, these Marinis did have this big V-twin of a motor in the frame, and this bike looks more like a 1000cc engine than a small 350. Now, this bike was a twin-cylinder 4-stroke with a carburetor on each cylinder, and it's said that these engines put out about 27 horsepower, and they did have a 6-speed gearbox and of course a dry clutch. Now the fuel tank also held about 10 litres of fuel, and this X model here was fitted with drum brakes on the rear and on the front, although subsequent Marini bikes would then be fitted with the much more modern hydraulic disc brakes all round. Although the owner on the day told me that this bike is still in regular use and he uses it right through the winter period, and I must say it's probably not much use as a full-blown off-road race bike at 150 kilos in weight, but for general road use and maybe some occasional green laning, this bike certainly looks like a comfortable thing to ride. But I have to say the Marini Riders Club did have many examples of these Italian stallions on display on their stand over the course of the weekend, although we can only really feature a couple of their bikes in this very short video. And this bike here is just another of the machines that was sitting on their stand on the day. Now, what they were actually like to ride, I'm not really sure, but I'd like to think that even for a 350, these V-twin motors would still be quite torquey, although, as I said, it does look quite heavy and cumbersome to be of any practical use as a serious off-roader. But again, another piece of Italian-made Morini engineering. And you certainly can't beat the Italians for stylish road machines, and it's thanks to the Moto Marini Owners Club for bringing along these examples to the Telford Classic Dirt Bike Show. Okay, and so as we make our way into the main exhibition hall, the first bike that we're going to take a look at is this beautiful 1979 440 Moto twin shocker. And this particular bike here is actually Roger Harvey's old race bike from back in the day, and as you can see, it's been fully restored by ex-Kramer watch rider and Holab Concepts owner Keith Ree. Now Keith has brought this bike along to present to Roger here at the show. Now Roger Harvey, as you know, is another one of the British motocross racing legends whose racing career spanned nearly 2 decades, culminating in, of course, Roger winning the British 125 Championship in 1983. And although Roger then had to retire from competitive racing in 1985 when he had a bad crash while he was racing in France, he was still involved with motocross and motorcycle racing in general, as he continued to be very active in the sport in a managerial role for many years after he retired from racing. And in this picture here you can see Roger being presented with his old Moto race bike from the bike's builder, Keith Ree, who is on the left there of our picture. But again, 2 racing legends from the golden days of motocross with the great Roger Harvey. And of course not forgetting Keith Ree on the left there, because Keith back in the day also rode a Moto for the late Brian Badger Goss, and he was also Kramer's watch rider back in 1981. So we're certainly in the presence here of a couple of the greats of our sport. Although I have to say that Keith certainly made a very good job of restoring Roger's old Moto, and that's just one of the things that tends to keep Keith busy these days as he refurbishes and rebuilds many of these old vintage dirt bikes for customers all over the UK and in Europe, and he has certainly a good reputation for his workmanship, and we've already featured many examples of Keith's bike building skills here on my YouTube channel in the past. Now, with regards to the future of Roger's old race bike, as far as I know, he's certainly no plans to put this bike back onto the track, and it will probably just take pride of place in his own personal collection of motorcycles that he's amassed over the years. But as you know, these 1979 Motos were still fantastic bikes to ride in their day, and they're still very much sought after with the twin shock racing riders of today, because they did have quite a similar chassis layout to the mighty 81 490 Mega 2, and maybe if you can't get your hands on one of those iconic 81 490 bikes, then these 79 440s are certainly a very good second choice replacement. Although this featured Moto here was just part of the many hundreds of old classics on display at the show over the course of the 2 days, and in the coming videos we'll feature more of these fantastic machines here on Classic Dirt Bike TV. But once again, another fantastic old twin choker restored by Keith Ree for racing legend Roger Harvey. Okay, so our next featured bike is another British classic, and this time it's a 1960s Greaves Challenger, and this will be the first of a few Greaves bikes that we're going to feature over the course of the following Telford Classic Dirt Bike Show videos. Now this featured example here is a bike that I don't know too much about because the owner wasn't really around at the time I grabbed these video clips, but it's certainly a Greaves Challenger, and more than likely this looks like a 250cc version. But these old vintage Greaves Challengers are just typical of the kind of bikes that you would have seen if you're of a certain age and you watch the old BBC Grandstand Winter Scrambles on the black and white televisions back in the 1960s, when you had the likes of Vic Eastwood and Brian Badger Goss and Alan Clough and Dave Bickers, who you would see tearing around a muddy racetrack at top speed on one of these old vintage Greaves machines, and you would just sit there in awe of these riders and just how fast they went on these old bikes, because the suspension travel was very limited at that time and it was very hard on the riders, and that's another reason I think that they all wore kidney belts around their waist back in the day to try and help keep all of their vital organs in place while they were bouncing around over the jumps. But this rider here certainly not superstitious, with that number 13 stamped on his bike, but nevertheless this bike here is another very nice example again of a classic Greaves racer with these old school drum brakes at the front and again here at the rear, which weren't great stoppers to be fair for their time, but these still were the motorcycle brake technology of their day, and they did still manage to help slow the bike down when required. Now the front of these Challengers had the Greaves leading link suspension system, which again had very limited travel, although the guys that rode these bikes back in the day were very hardy and, as you know, tough as old boots, but then they had to be because motocross suspension at that time was still very basic. Although I have to say that this featured bike here, it does look like an original machine from that 1960s era, because it does appear to have all of the right parts that came with these old Greaves machines when they were first available for sale in the mid 1960s. Now, just to finish off this part 1 video from the 2022 Telford Classic Dirt Bike Show, we're going to take a look at a very special motorcycle indeed, and this superb 1961 Leto 500 is Sten London's World Championship winning machine from that same year. Now, I do intend to do a more lengthy and detailed video on this bike in the future, but for now, let's just take a quick browse around this machine. Now, although this bike is titled as a Leto, we all know that it's actually a Monarch 500 that was built at the Monarch factory in Varberg in Sweden, and it's also documented that only 5 of these Monarch Letos were ever built, which were all really just factory machines for the Monarch works riders back in the day, and none of these bikes were ever sold to the general public. But it's quite a common sight to see fake versions of these Monarch 500s, and owners often pass replica bikes off as factory originals, although when you consider that only 5 were ever made, the chances are that many of them will be Mickey Mouse bikes, although our example here is definitely the real deal and is currently owned by Peter Hollinshead. Now, with regards the bike's motor, which was an Albin-based engine, and it's said that these big 4-banger Albins had a bore of 79mm and a stroke of around 100mm, and the original design of this Albin Monarch engine really dates back to 1942, when Monarch were building these motors for the Swedish military, and every single component of this engine was manufactured in-house at the Monarch factory. But as you can see, it's an absolute work of art when you see all of the engineering that's gone into producing this wonderful piece of iron. Now, as far as I know, with regards to the overall condition of this bike, I'm not sure if it's recently undergone a refurbishment of some sort, although we do know that Sten London did actually perform a full restoration on his old World Championship winning bike soon after he retired from racing, and it's said to have taken Sten over 2 years to complete. But as I said, I don't know for sure if this is the same condition the bike's in since that rebuild. But I have to say that whether the bike's been done again or not, it still looks absolutely stunning. But the bike was certainly getting a lot of attention from the punters at the show over the 2 days, and I think it even won a prize at the end of the day. Now, it's said that the Monarch factory hammered out these fuel tanks from a single sheet of aluminium, and it's said that if you look close enough to these tanks, you can still see minor indentations where the hammers worked the metal into shape. And once again, as you'd expect, drum brakes for 1961, and these were pretty good for an old drum brake type system, because this bike certainly wasn't light, and it did take a bit of slowing down if you were on the gas. Now, with regards the front forks on this bike, now these are very early Seriani forks that were actually manufactured specifically for this particular bike by the Italian suspension company, and as of course the years went on, Seriani then began to sell their motorcycle forks all over the world. And one of the other interesting facts here is that these wheels, which were made by Dunlop, were again specifically designed for this Monarch Leto race bike. Now, at the front of the bike, the front hub is a Pranafa unit, which once again had quite good stopping power for this big 500, although just about every other part on this bike just seems to ooze quality, and that's more than likely how Sten London managed to win the world title on this bike in 1961. And in actual fact, the great Roger de Coster was once quoted as saying that this Sten London Leto Monarch was probably the best looking bike he'd ever seen. And because of the build quality of this great bike, that's probably how the great Sten London took this bike to 13 Grand Prix wins and the world title in 1961. And it's also documented that he lined up for 56 Grand Prix starts when he raced this machine. And as I said, we will take a more detailed look at this lovely bike in a future video here on my Classic Dirt Bike TV channel. So there you have it, the first selection of bikes from the 2022 Telford Classic Dirt Bike Show, and these coming up here are just a few of the machines that you can see in part 2, so don't forget to subscribe to my channel if you want to see more bikes from this fantastic Telford event. So until next time, thanks for watching your number one and favourite Classic Dirt Bike TV channel.